On the loneliest edge of a storm, beaten island, a woman the world had already discarded was about to drag a dying stranger from the sea and pull disaster into her quiet life. The cold was never absent on the Isle of Sky Reach. It lived in the stone walls of Avery Rowan's cottage, in the damp wool wrapped around her shoulders, and in the ache that settled deep inside her bones before dawn and stayed until nightfall. She no longer fought it. Resistance belonged to people who still believed life could be improved. Avery had long since learned a different skill. She endured. Her little cottage stood beyond the village, beyond the fish sheds, beyond the last crooked lantern post, as if even the land itself had decided she belonged at a distance. That was where the villagers preferred her. Close enough to mend a fever, set a broken wrist, or mix bitter herbs for a child's cough. Far enough that they did not have to remember too often that she existed. In a kingdom ruled by wolves, strength was worshipped like religion. Sharp teeth, hard hands, violent power, and bloodline dominance decided a person's worth. Avery had none of those things. She could not shift. She had no brutal force hidden inside her bones. Her magic was soft, almost invisible. It lived in healing teas, poultices, salves, stitches, and the strange instinctive understanding she had always carried for pain. That made her useful. It did not make her respected. The villagers paid her in stale bread, fish scraps, old candles, and gratitude so thin it barely covered their contempt. She accepted it all because survival had taught her to take what would ask for nothing more. Asking led to disappointment. Hope led to humiliation. Solitude, at least, was honest. Then the storm came. It arrived after sunset with a violence that made the whole island feel fragile. Wind hammered the cottage until the beams groaned. Rain lashed the shutters in furious bursts. The sea, usually a distant roar below the cliffs, became something monstrous and hungry. Avery spent the night crouched by her hearth, feeding it driftwood piece by piece, listening to the roof shudder overhead and wondering whether dawn would find her buried beneath her own home. When morning finally came, the world outside looked wrecked beyond recognition. The shoreline had become a yard of broken branches, torn kelp, and shattered pieces of boats that had not survived the fury. The sky was a bruised gray. The tide moved in slow, greedy fingers over the black sand. Avery picked her way down the slick path to see what the storm had thrown at the edge of the world this time. That was when she saw him. A man lay half buried near the waterline, one arm twisted beneath him, dark hair matted with blood and seawater. For one sharp moment, fear rose fast in her throat. Strangers rarely brought anything but trouble. Men from the mainland meant taxes, conscription, punishment, or war. But this one did not move, and the tide was already reaching for him. Compassion overcame fear the way it always did, quietly and against her own better judgment. She scrambled down the rocks, boots slipping, pulse hammering. Up close, he was even more alarming. He was enormous, built with the kind of power that made her instantly aware of how small she was. Broad shoulders, heavy muscle, scars like pale maps cut across his skin. He looked less like an ordinary man and more like someone carved for battle and violence. A jagged wound along his side had soaked his dark clothing through with blood. Her fingers found his pulse at last. Faint, unsteady, but alive. Getting him back cottage nearly destroyed her. She dragged him inch by inch over wet stone and rough sand, gasping with effort, knees tearing open, palms raw. Twice she thought she would have to let go. Twice she looked down at his unconscious face and kept moving. There was something in his stillness that reached into the loneliest place inside her. As if some broken part of him recognized the broken parts she kept hidden. By the time she finally pulled him across her threshold, her whole body was shaking. She fed the fire her last dry wood, boiled water, cut away his ruined clothing, and saw at once how close to death he had truly come. His body was marked by old wars. Scars crossed his chest and shoulders in every direction. The new wound in his side was deep and ugly, likely driven there by shattered timber from a wrecked ship. Avery worked with desperate concentration, cleaning the wound, stitching it closed with steady hands despite the trembling in her arms. He never woke. As firelight moved over his harsh, beautiful face, Avery could not escape one disturbing thought. This was no ordinary castaway. As Avery stitched the stranger's wounds beside the fire, she had no idea she was saving the most dangerous man in the kingdom. The man she saved spoke little, revealed nothing, and watched her with the unnerving focus of someone who had not felt safe in a very long time. For 3 days, the stranger remained suspended between life and death. He burned with fever so fierce it turned his skin hot despite the winter chill. His breathing came rough and uneven, And every time Avery changed the bandages on his side, she found more blood than she wanted to see. She slept in a chair beside his narrow cot, waking at the slightest sound, bathing his face with cool cloths, forcing willow bark tea between his lips whenever his swallowing reflex returned. In delirium, he muttered fragments she could not understand. Sometimes his voice dropped into a low, thunderous murmur that filled her tiny cottage with strange authority even while he lay helpless. Other times, a single name escaped him over and over again, heavy with grief. He sounded less like a sick man and more like someone fighting a nightmare no sleep could soften. On the fourth morning, Avery opened her eyes and found him watching her. The fever had broken, clarity had returned, and his gaze made the room feel suddenly smaller. His eyes were pale, piercing gray, the color of a winter sky moments before snowfall. They moved over her face with absolute awareness, not lazily, not weakly, but with the dangerous calm of a man trained to observe everything before speaking. Fear returned to her all at once. He was awake now. A stranger. A giant in her home. A question with no safe answer. He asked where he was, and even roughened by illness, his voice held command rather than uncertainty. Avery explained softly that he had washed ashore after the storm, and that she had brought him in before the tide could take him. He pushed himself up enough to glance around the cottage, taking in the hanging herbs, the hearth, the single bed, the absence of wealth. There was nothing there but survival. Nothing there but her. When his gaze fell to the neat stitches along his side, he understood what she had done. He gave only one name in return. Theron. Nothing more followed. No title. No home. No reason for his injuries. Just that one sharp, heavy name that seemed too large for her little cottage. Avery offered her own name and immediately felt how small it sounded beside his. The days that followed settled into an intimate silence that neither of them fully understood. Theron obeyed her instructions without complaint. Though obedience seemed unnatural on him, he drank the bitter broth she gave him, let her clean and redress the wound, and accepted the restrictions his healing required. Yet through all of it, he watched her. Not like a predator, not like a man measuring weakness. More like someone trying to solve something he had never encountered before. That look unsettled her far more than open aggression would have. She began to learn him through fragments. The way his jaw tightened when pain struck unexpectedly. The way his body always angled toward the door when he slept, as if danger were his natural companion. The way one hand drifted instinctively toward where a weapon should have been. He was undeniably a warrior, though she still had no idea whose. Once he grew strong enough to rise, he transformed her daily life without meaning to. He chopped enough wood in one afternoon to last her weeks. He repaired the storm damage on her roof with a steady efficiency that made it obvious he had worked under worse conditions than this. He carried water, split kindling, reinforced a broken latch, and took burdens from her hands as though his body had been built specifically to remove struggle from the space around him. That frightened her too, because she had grown used to carrying everything alone. There were moments, small but unforgettable, when the distance between them changed shape. One afternoon, while reaching for herbs from a high shelf, Avery nearly slipped from a rickety stool. Theron caught her before she fell, one large hand closing around her arm with such careful control that the contact sent something startling through her chest. His grip had strength enough to injure and gentleness enough not to. He let go at once, but the warmth of that touch stayed with her long after. By the end of the week, Avery realized she had begun marking her days by his presence. The cottage no longer felt empty in the old way. She listened for his footsteps, looked for him in the firelight, felt a strange loosening in her chest whenever she found him seated quietly near the hearth instead of gone. He had become part of the shape of her home before she had fully admitted that possibility to herself. And yet silence remained between them where the truth should have been. Theron never spoke of his past. Avery never asked. Some instinct warned her that whatever lived behind his silence was vast, dangerous, and too powerful to fit safely inside her small world. She told herself it was better not to know. Then one night, the real danger inside him finally revealed itself. Just as Avery began to believe the stranger might become the first warmth in her lonely life, something colder than death woke beneath his skin. His wounds were healing. But the true threat had never been the blood on his side. It was the impossible winter living inside his body. The relapse came in the middle of the night. Avery woke to the sound of the cot shaking beneath him. At first she thought the wound had reopened. But when she crossed the room, she found something far stranger. Theron was trembling violently under the blankets, his teeth clenched, his skin pale with a cold so severe it looked unnatural. The fire had not died. The cottage was warm enough. Yet frost seemed to cling to him as though winter itself had crawled under his skin. She piled every blanket she owned over him. It changed nothing. His breathing came in sharp, ragged bursts. His hands clenched and released against the sheets. Another name escaped him in delirium, followed by the kind of grief that made the room feel unbearably intimate. This was not the suffering of a man with fever. This was old pain, deep pain, pain that learned to live inside the bones. Avery touched his forehead and nearly recoiled. He was ice cold. Not cool from a draft or pale from blood loss. He was cold in a way flesh should never be. The unnatural chill rushed into her fingertips and seemed to linger there, and suddenly the fear she had kept quiet for days took shape. Theron was not merely mysterious. He was carrying something wrong inside him. Something bigger than injury. Without planning to, Avery sat beside him and kept her hand against his skin. She did the only thing she knew how to do when pain became larger than remedies. She soothed. Softly, almost under her breath, she began to hum an old melody her mother had once used on hard nights. It was wordless and simple, a tune built more from comfort than music. She had not sung it in years. At first nothing changed. Then the tension in his body eased. The shivering slowly lost its violence. His breathing steadied. The frost like cold receded in gradual waves, as if the sound itself were reaching somewhere inside him that medicine could not touch. Avery kept humming, too stunned to stop. The cottage grew strangely still around them. Even the fire seemed to lean toward the sound. Something warm flickered in her chest. It had nothing to do with the hearth. It felt internal, instinctive, almost waking. Not painful. Not frightening at first. Just unfamiliar, as though the song had turned a key in a locked place she had never known existed. By the time Theron finally slept, the impossible cold had faded to ordinary human warmth. Avery remained beside him long after, afraid to move and afraid even more of what that moment meant. Her voice had done something real. Something beyond comfort. The next morning, his eyes found her the moment he woke. The guarded assessment she had grown used to was gone. In its place was curiosity stripped raw of distance. He wanted to know what she had done. Avery could only tell the truth. She did not know. She had simply sung. That answer did not satisfy either of them, but it changed the air between them permanently. After that night, the silence cracked. Theron still kept the core of himself hidden, but he began to speak in fragments about the world beyond the island. Vast forests, high mountains, mainland cities carved from stone and history. He described them with an unexpected depth that made him seem less like a warrior and more like a man who had spent too long carrying entire landscapes inside his mind. Avery found herself opening in return. She spoke of the island, the villagers, the isolation, the quiet shame of being considered lesser in a world obsessed with savage power. For the first time in her life, someone listened as if her words mattered. Then came the moment that shifted everything. One windy afternoon on the shore, while gathering mussels among the rocks, Theron reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. The gesture was brief and gentle, but it landed like fire. His calloused fingertips lingered against her skin just long enough to make her pulse stumble. The way he looked at her afterward held no mockery, no pity, no condescension. Only intensity, recognition. And something so much softer than she was prepared for that it frightened more than his silence ever had. He treated her gifts as real power. Not weakness. Not an oddity. Not some lesser consolation for the strength she lacked. That single shift changed something fundamental in Avery. The world had always measured her by what she could not become. Theron was the first person to look at what she was and call it worthy. By then it was already too late for caution. She was falling in love with him. She knew it in the way she searched for him each morning. In the way relief flooded her when she found him by the hearth. In the way his rare smiles altered the whole shape of her day. And he felt it too. She saw it in the deepening softness of his gaze, in the excuses he found to stand near her, in the unbearable tension humming between them whenever their hands brushed. Then, on the very night he seemed finally ready to tell her the truth, horses arrived outside her door. The fragile world they built in silence shattered the moment armed riders called the stranger, by the only title Avery had never imagined hearing. The wounded man she had healed was never a nameless castaway at all. He was the king, and with that revelation, everything Avery believed about him broke at once. The sound reached the cottage before dawn had fully deepened into night again. Hoofbeats, armor. Men carrying authority into a place that had never belonged to power. Theron changed the moment he heard it. The warmth left his expression first. Then everything else followed. His body straightened into rigid readiness. The softness Avery had come to know vanished behind something colder and sharper, something so instinctive that she realized with a rush of dread it had always been there beneath the surface. He moved to the door, looked through the crack, and told her to stay back in a voice that made her obey before fear even caught up. Fists struck the wood. A command followed. When Theron opened the door, 5 men stood outside in black and silver armor, marked with a wolf sigil she recognized from the mainland stories, whispered by sailors and merchants. They were not ordinary soldiers. They belonged to the Alpha King's elite royal guard. The moment they saw him, every one of them dropped to one knee. The world inside Avery's chest seemed to stop. Their relief was immediate, reverent, shaken. They addressed him not as captain, not as lord, not as some unknown noble survivor of a shipwreck. They called him Your Majesty. There, inside her poor little cottage, still carrying scars from the storm and the tenderness of the life they had built together, stood the King of the Isles, King Theron Vale. The name hit with a kind of violence memory cannot soften. Every unanswered question rearranged itself. The command in his voice, the scars, the impossible authority, the way he moved as if danger were beneath his notice. He had not been a soldier or an outlaw or some forgotten warrior. He had been the man the entire kingdom feared and obeyed. The cold monarch of Blackstone Halls. The ruler whose wars reached even the edges of her forgotten island. And he had let her go on not knowing. Theron looked at her, but the man from her hearth seemed gone. In his place stood the king the world belonged to, distant, powerful, impossible to reach. He told her she would come with them. Even without harshness, the decree felt like iron. Avery's hurt rose faster than tears. She had opened her home, her hands, and the guarded corners of her heart to him, believing he was simply a wounded man. Now she understood that every moment of intimacy had been shared beneath a shadow he had chosen not to name. He had let her care for him while hiding the one truth that changed everything. The ride to the capital blurred into cold misery. She was given a fine cloak, a strong horse, and the outward signs of protection, but every courtesy felt like mockery. Theron rode ahead with the royal guard and did not look back once. The further they moved from the island, the more completely the private man disappeared into the rulers she did not know. Avery felt as if she had been scooped up with the wreckage from the storm and carried somewhere she would never belong. The capital proved that fear right. The fortress of Arian rose from dark cliffs like something born from old war and older winter. Black stone towers cut into the sky. The wind screamed through the battlements. Nobles and guards and servants alike watched her arrival with the kind of curiosity reserved for scandal. She was a common healer from an outer island, dragged into the center of royal power by the king himself. That alone made her dangerous in the eyes of the court. The rooms given to her were luxurious enough to overwhelm. Silk bedding, heavy drapes, gold-trimmed furniture, a fire always burning in the hearth. To anyone else, it might have looked like elevation. To Avery, it felt like a polished cage. Guards remained outside her door at all hours. When Theron came to her that first night, he wore black and silver like the fortress itself had crowned him. Every trace of the shipwrecked stranger was buried beneath the image of the king. Yet, when he spoke her name, something in his voice cracked just enough to remind her he was not untouched either. He tried to explain without fully defending himself. He had not hidden his identity to amuse himself. He had hidden it because whatever existed between them had begun before he knew how to stop it. On the island with her, he had been able to forget himself long enough to become only a man. That, he admitted, was precisely the problem. Avery wanted anger to protect her, but sorrow kept cutting through it. He had not lied because he enjoyed control. He had lied because the truth carried consequences bigger than either of them. And when he finally revealed the reason, her betrayal transformed into something colder and more frightening. His bloodline was cursed, not symbolically, not superstitiously, truly. For a century, the kings of his line had lived under a punishment tied to love itself. If the ruling king gave his heart fully, the beast inside him would twist into something monstrous and uncontrollable. Love did not heal the curse. It fed it, strengthened it, drove it toward madness and destruction until the man was consumed from within. He told her his father had died that way. He told her family had been destroyed by it. And he told her, with the bleak honesty of a man already losing the fight, That meeting her had awakened what 100 years of cold control had kept dormant. When Avery realized the king loved her, and that love itself was killing him, she understood their greatest danger was no longer distance or deception. It was each other. For 100 years he had ruled with an iced-over heart, because the one thing he was never allowed to feel was love. And now that impossible feeling had found her. The truth left Avery reeling for days. Everything she had sensed on the island, the unnatural cold, the grief in his sleep, the way her humming soothed something deeper than pain, suddenly belonged to a pattern far older and darker than either of them. Theron was not simply carrying trauma. He was carrying a bloodline curse sharpened over generations. A king who loved became a danger to himself, to everyone around him, and eventually to the kingdom. The name he had cried out during those freezing nights was not the name of a lost lover, as Avery had once feared. It belonged to his sister, a piece of family history soaked in death. A reminder that the beast born from love did not care who it destroyed once it fully woke. That changed the shape of Avery's pain. His distance since bringing her to the capital had not been rejection. It had been fear. Desperate, brutal fear. He was trying to starve his own heart in order to survive her. Yet even with that knowledge, he could not send her away. And she could not stop loving him. The court seer entered their lives soon after with the soft authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Morwen Ash looked ancient and brittle, but her eyes held too much calculation for age to make her harmless. She spoke of the curse with certainty. History, prophecy, inevitability, everything in her tone insisted that what lived in Theron's blood could not be altered. In her view, Avery's presence was no miracle. It was disaster wearing a human face. Theron respected the seer, but Avery never fully trusted her. Maybe it was the coldness beneath the woman's pity. Maybe it was the way Morwen looked at her, as though she were already condemned. Whatever the reason, Avery's instincts pulled away from the old woman, even while everyone else deferred to her knowledge. If the curse was real, then to Avery it was also something else. A condition, a pattern, a sickness, and sickness could be studied. That belief became her anchor. While Theron struggled to maintain distance, Avery buried herself in the royal library. Dust, heavy shelves towered around her like a maze of forgotten minds. She searched histories, bloodline records, fragmentary spells, old healing lore, and any mention of curses tied not to choice but inheritance. Most texts contradicted each other. Some were useless. Some were written to terrify rather than explain. But hidden beneath the superstition and myth, she began to find glimpses of possibility. Curses attached to blood and emotion were not always absolute. Some could be weakened by outside magic, especially if that magic came from a source the curse had not been built to recognize. That thought stayed with her, because if there was one thing the old magic surrounding Theron clearly did not understand, it was her. Meanwhile, the atmosphere inside the palace changed by the day. Theron kept her close, but never close enough. They ate meals across distances too large for comfort, walked in frost-bitten gardens where their hands never touched, existed in a space full of almosts that hurt more than absence. He was trying to protect himself and protect her at the same time, and the effort was visibly destroying him. Dark circles appeared under his eyes. His control frayed. The cold around him deepened at odd hours, and the castle itself seemed to feel the strain. The court noticed. Whispers spread like rot. Some called Avery a seductress. Others claimed she had bewitched the king. Her common birth became a weapon people used to explain what they could not understand. No one wanted to believe their ruler's greatest vulnerability had come not from war or politics, but from a healer with kind hands and a voice soft enough to calm storms. Morwen, meanwhile, grew more insistent. In private, she advised that Avery be sent away. In public, she cloaked that cruelty in concern for the realm. The woman knew far too much about the curse, its phases, its triggers, and the exact shape of the king's decline. The more Avery listened, the more one terrible possibility began to form. Morwen did not sound like a scholar speaking about a phenomenon she had studied. She sounded like someone who knew the curse intimately. Still, Avery lacked proof. All she had was instinct, and fragments of research, and the tightening certainty that time was running out. Theron was growing worse. Love, once discovered, could not simply be unfelt, and whatever power had stirred inside Avery on the island had not revealed itself clearly enough for her to trust it. But she refused to surrender. The healer in her could not accept inevitability where life was still fighting. As Avery searched deeper for a cure, she began to suspect that the woman advising the throne knew far more about the curse than any innocent seer ever should. The court called Avery the king's weakness. But the real poison in the castle was not the healer they despised, it was the woman pretending to guide them all. Avery's search for answers became an obsession. Day after day, she returned to the library until the librarians stopped trying to hide their suspicion. She read until her eyes burned and her fingers ached from turning brittle pages. She followed every thread she could find: ancient songs, resonance magic, bloodline bindings, emotional curses, old witchcraft buried under layers of revision and fear. Most of it confirmed only how dangerous the king's condition had become. Yet beneath those warnings lay one recurring idea: not all magic yielded to force. Some forms of power were built on harmony, sound, and internal balance. That mattered. Because whatever had happened on the island, when she hummed over Theron, had not been accident alone. Morwen found her in the library one afternoon and offered the solution with cruel gentleness. If the curse fed on love, then it could be starved. Avery needed to leave. Not ceremonially, not half-heartedly. She needed to break Theron's heart so completely that his feeling would collapse inward, and the curse would lose its fuel. The old woman presented it as mercy, as sacrifice, as noble necessity. To Avery, it felt like mutilation disguised as wisdom. She could imagine leaving. She could imagine breaking herself. What she could not imagine was believing that the only way to save the man, to condemn him to the same century of loneliness that had nearly frozen him alive before she arrived. That suggestion hardened something in her. From that point on, Morwen's mask began slipping. The old woman still wore concern in public, but Avery started noticing the relish hidden inside her warnings. The satisfaction, the ancient hunger beneath her pity. This was not the grief of someone who had watched generations suffer helplessly. It was something uglier. Outside the library, the palace had become openly hostile. Nobles no longer hid their contempt when Avery entered a room. Servants passed gossip from corridor to corridor like kindling. The court did not simply distrust her. It needed her to be the problem, because if she was not, then the kingdom's fear had deeper roots than one healer from an outer island. She became a symbol for everything they could not control. That tension finally broke at the winter feast. The great hall filled with the highest lords and ladies of the realm, their jewels and furs glinting under the torchlight, while unease moved beneath the ceremony like a second current. Theron sat on the throne, with all the rigid force of a man holding himself together through will alone. Avery was placed near him in a position that was both honor and provocation. The queen's seat sat close enough to scandalize the court, and every eye in the room understood the implication. One lord, Malik Rowancrest, chose to strike first. His toast came coated in false loyalty and aimed like a knife. He spoke of burdens, of distractions, of the need for kings to free themselves from lesser attachments. The insult was clean enough to avoid open punishment and cruel enough to land exactly where intended. The whole hall understood who the burden was meant to be. Avery felt the humiliation like heat under her skin. Theron's hands tightened on the throne arms. The air around him shifted with dangerous cold. It might have ended there, with restrained fury and one more scar laid across the evening, if Morwen had not stepped forward to finish what Malik began. Her kindness disappeared completely. In front of the court, she called Avery an unworthy stray, a common influence poisoning the sacred balance of the realm. She spoke as though Avery's presence itself were contamination. Every old wound Avery carried, the years of being dismissed, tolerated, belittled, and made small, rose at once at the force of those words. She had saved him. She had loved him. She had tried to cure what no one else had even understood. And still they would let in while naming her the cause. Something snapped. Not in anger alone. In pain. In the unbearable pressure of a lifetime spent swallowing humiliation until it turned to poison inside the chest. The sound that tore out of Avery then was not a cry. It was release. It blasted through the great hall like a physical force, shattering goblets, extinguishing torches, cracking stone beneath her feet. The power in her voice hit the room and the room responded. And at the exact same moment, the force struggling inside Theron finally broke free. One scream from the woman they called powerless shattered the hall, and unleashed the cursed beast the kingdom had feared for 100 years. The woman the kingdom mocked as weak brought the hall to its knees with her voice. But in doing so, she triggered the nightmare sleeping inside the king. The transformation began by echoes of Avery's scream, had even finished rolling through the chamber. Theron rose halfway from the throne, then convulsed as if something inside him had torn open. Shadows spilled from his body in violent waves. His scream followed hers, But where hers had carried pain, his carried rupture. It was the sound of a man being split from himself. The nobles nearest the dais stumbled backward in terror as cold and darkness id outward from the throne like a storm given shape. Then the king disappeared. What replaced him was no wolf, it was something more terrible. A beast shaped from shadow, rage, grief, and old curse-warped love. It towered over the hall, vast and unstable, with burning eyes like coals buried in black smoke. Its claws struck stone and left gouges deeper than swords could make. Every movement was charged with enough force to destroy architecture, not just flesh. It was a nightmare born from devotion corrupted into violence. The first swing of one shadow, clawed limb destroyed part of the wall and sent an entire watchtower section collapsing into rubble. Panic devoured the court. Lords and ladies fled in all directions. The royal guard charged with astonishing bravery and were thrown aside like toys. Spears shattered. Men slammed into columns. Dust and screams filled the air. The beast did not seem to recognize allegiance, status, or plea. It was pure catastrophic instinct, striking at the world around it because the feeling inside it had become too large to contain. Avery stood in the center of that chaos and understood the final truth all at once. Morwen had wanted this. The old woman was not some helpless scholar preserving old warnings. She was watching the collapse with triumph too naked to hide. Her satisfaction twisted her face into something ancient and ugly. In that instant, Avery knew the answer she had been chasing in the library. Morwen was not merely a seer tied to the curse, she was the witch behind it. But there was no time for accusation. The beast was about to tear the hall apart. Theron was inside it somewhere, drowning under fury and pain. And no one in that room could stop what love had turned monstrous. No one except her. Fear remained in Avery's body, but something greater rose to meet it. The power in her voice still hummed through her bones. She had shattered stone with grief. Now she needed to do the impossible with love. As guards fell back and nobles fled past her, Avery stepped forward. She did not shout. She did not command. She remembered instead a cold island night, a shivering man, and the old melody that had calmed the winter inside him. She called his name first, softly, using the voice of a healer reaching for someone in pain, rather than a queen trying to control a monster. The sound moved strangely through the ruined hall. It cut through collapsing masonry, through screams, through the beast's roar, not because it was louder, but because it carried intent. It reached for the man, not the curse, for the wounded place beneath the rage. The beast froze. Its burning eyes swung toward her. The guard line, already broken, fell completely back in stunned silence as Avery took another step forward. Her whole body trembled, but her voice did not. She began to hum. The melody flowed into the hall with a quiet steadiness that did not belong in a scene of destruction. It was the sound of safety. Of warmth. Of the tiny cottage by the sea where a wounded stranger had once slept without nightmares for the first time in memory. It was not desperate love, the kind the curse fed on. It was healing love, patient, soothing, rooted in care rather than possession. That distinction mattered. The shadows around the beast churned violently. It let out a low sound that was no longer rage but conflict. The curse fought the melody. Fury fought memory. But Avery kept moving, kept humming, pouring everything gentle and stubborn inside her into the sound. She told him, in voice rather than words, that she was there. That he was not alone. Then she held out her hand. Not as ruler. Not as savior. As invitation. The beast lowered its head. The burning in its eyes faltered. The shadow form began to collapse inward. Not violently but painfully. As though something monstrous was being asked to remember it had once been a man. Darkness folded back into flesh. Smoke dissolved. Enormous claws shrank into human hands. And there, on the cracked stone floor of the great hall, Theron reappeared, pale, trembling, gasping, but human, alive. The kingdom's worst fear had just been calmed, not by a blade, not by force, but by the woman they had all dismissed. But the danger was not over. Because across the ruined hall, Morwen's face had finally shed all pretense, and her fury burned greener and older than anything human. With the beast subdued and the truth finally exposed, the woman who created the curse stepped out from behind her mask, and Avery's true battle began. She had once been the forgotten healer at the edge of the sea, but now the entire kingdom stood in silence as her voice proved stronger than a century-old curse. Morwen's rage transformed her. The old seer's skin seemed to tighten and wither in the same breath, her eyes blazing with a poisoned green light that belonged to no natural age. Whatever softness she had worn until then peeled away like a disguise, burning off. Ancient malice stood revealed in the shattered hall. She screamed at Avery not with grief, but with personal hatred. Avery had done the one thing the witch had believed impossible. She had soothed what had been designed only to destroy. That failure broke Moan's control. Dark magic gathered around the witch in sharp, twisting currents. The surviving guards recoiled. Dust and broken stone circled her like a storm drawn to rot. She meant to strike, to kill the woman who had turned love from weapon into cure. To finish in one brutal instant what generations of suffering had failed to conclude. She never got the chance. Theron rose. He moved with restored force, crossing the ruined space between them with terrifying speed. There was no hesitation in him now, no internal cold, no fracture between king and beast. The darkness that had once threatened to consume him had been brought back into harmony. And that changed everything. When he seized Morwen by the throat, it was not just a king taking justice. It was a century of bloodline pain finally reaching its source. Her body fought, his did not waver. The witch who had poisoned kings, destroyed families, and fed on inherited misery died in the hall she had tried to ruin. Silence came down hard after that. Broken torches smoked along the walls. Rubble covered the floor. Surviving courtiers stared in open disbelief, not only at the witch's corpse but at Avery herself. The same people who had called her weak now stood in the aftermath of a miracle they could not explain away. She had not fought like a warrior. She had not triumphed with cruelty. She had simply become the one thing the curse had never been built to withstand. A sound of true healing. A love that soothed instead of consumed. Theron turned from the witch and crossed the hall to Avery. Then, before nobles, guards, and lords who had spent weeks despising her, the king went to his knees. That image changed the kingdom more than any speech ever could. He took her hands like they were sacred and bowed his forehead to them with a reverence that belonged not to politics, but to truth. In that one gesture he named her more clearly than titles ever could. Savior, anchor, equal. The woman who had restored not only his body but his soul. Avery's tears came then, not from weakness but from release. All her life, the world had measured her against force and found her lacking. Yet in the end, it was her softness, her steadiness, her healer's heart, and her impossible voice that had saved the king and the kingdom together. In the weeks that followed, the castle changed. Repairs covered the visible damage, but the deeper transformation ran through the people. The chill in the stones faded. The court's cruelty quieted under the weight of what they had witnessed. Some still feared Avery, others revered her. Most simply no longer dared dismiss her. She had become something the realm had no easy name for. They started calling her the Whisper Queen. Theron did not resist it. By then, he had changed too. The internal cold that had haunted him for a century no longer ruled him. It had not vanished entirely. Avery could still feel the old curse sleeping deep within his blood. But it no longer held command. Her voice had reached the beast and taught it rest. That was stronger than eradication. It was balance. One morning, they stood together on a high balcony above the sea-laced archipelago. Dawn spilled gold and rose across the horizon. Theron stood behind her with his arms around her waist, his body radiating an ordinary human warmth that still felt miraculous. Avery leaned back into him and looked out at the world that had once seemed far too large and cruel to ever make room for her. Now it had no choice. She was no longer the outcast healer surviving on fish scraps and endurance. She had a place, a name, a purpose, and a man who loved her with a devotion no curse would ever be allowed to twist again. Still, neither of them pretended the danger had vanished forever. The curse remained in the bloodline, quieter now, weakened, sleeping rather than dead. But Avery no longer feared that truth. She understood her own power now, not as lesser magic, not as background softness, but as something rare enough to rewrite fate. And if darkness ever stirred again beneath the old royal blood, the kingdom already knew exactly whose voice could command the storm back into silence. The curse was sleeping now, but if the darkness in the old bloodline ever woke again, the realm already knew the only woman who could sing a king back from ruin. Subscribe for more long-form fantasy storytelling filled with emotion, mystery, twists, and cinematic endings.